It has been nearly 2 years since I first introduced you to this heaping pile of wasted potential. I thought there would be no possible way it would ever wind up on my desk again. Well, a lot has changed between March 2024 and December 2025. Not only am I going to be turning this server back on, I'm also going to be finding it a permanent home in my server rack. This is the ASRock Rack 4U12G BC-250, and it has 12 nodes of Ryzen APUs inside, otherwise known as the same APUs from the PlayStation 5. And it just might be, finally, my new cloud gaming server. Welcome back to Craft Computing, everyone. As always, I'm Jeff. So back in March of 2024, I started a video with a glass of scotch on my desk. It's the universal sign of things aren't going well here on Craft Computing. The ASRock Rack 4U12G BC-250 is such a unique and cool piece of hardware that I desperately wanted to work, but technical and driver limitations made that dream virtually impossible. As a quick recap, the BC-250 is a cryptocurrency mining node created by AMD and ASRock in an attempt to sell binned-down PlayStation 5 APUs to take advantage of the crypto mining boom. Inside the heart of a PlayStation 5 is the AMD Cyan Skillfish APU with 8 cores and 16 threads of Ryzen Zen 2, 36 compute units of RDNA 2 graphics, along with a shared 16GB pool of GDDR6 memory. The BC-250 that we have right here is rocking the same physical chip, but it has been cut down a bit to just 6 cores instead of 8, along with 2/3 of the GPU horsepower, having 24 compute units instead of 36. But even with the binned-down specs, these should still make some pretty decent gaming machines, not to mention the fact that there are 12 of them inside of this server. In my original video about the BC-250, I gave some pricing history for these oddball little units. How they started out priced for crypto bros at nearly $15,000 for the server. But when the GPU mining craze became obsolete, they were liquidated off at well under $1,000 each, and I was able to snag a full server brand new in box for just $700. Also in that video, I went through my nearly 2 weeks worth of attempts to get these nodes up and running to be able to play games, and why I thought that was never going to happen. See, this isn't just an AMD APU that was slapped into a PlayStation 5. The Cyan Skillfish was a custom-made part for Sony by AMD. While it contains a lot of AMD's off-the-shelf architecture, it's a mishmash of different generations that never saw a PC equivalent release. Inside of this APU, we're looking at AMD's Zen 2 mobile CPU, but not exactly the same mobile CPU that you got in laptops. In fact, Chips and Cheese has a great article outlining the differences between the actual Zen 2 and the Zen 2 cores that existed in the PlayStation 5 and the BC-250. But the GPU portion is even more fragmented, with, as far as I understand, a mix of Vega, RDNA 1, and RDNA 2 components. In my first test with the BC-250, not a single driver package ever installed properly, as some portion of the hardware always conflicted with the drivers. Which is a shame, because while these may not be the most powerful PCs in the world, they still could be put to use in general tasks. But without driver support, they were destined for e-waste. After that video was published, I was so confident that the BC-250 would never see the light of day as a general computing platform, let alone a gaming PC, that I sold my BC-250 to a friend of mine for the same $700 that I paid for it. And I thought I'd be done with it forever. And over the course of the next year, the market for them completely fell out from the bottom, with prices falling to absurd levels. Browsing eBay late one night, I saw a complete BC-250 posted for just $350 shipped. Half the price that I had paid for mine. Still too expensive though, as it would still not have driver support or video out for desktop use. But that seller accepted offers, a dangerous feature to have available on a product in a pricing freefall, especially when Jeff is browsing eBay late one night. So I submitted an offer of $250 with free shipping. And they accepted it. That was not for a single node. That was for this entire chassis filled with nodes plus server rails, which means I paid the low price of just $20.83 per node. And now, we just had to play the waiting game to see if the community would rally around the BC-250 and bring full driver support. And rally around this obscure piece of hardware the community did. Not only can you get these nodes to play games now, they've actually been given an air of legitimate support. As of Mesa 25.1, the drivers are mainlined into Linux, meaning that for most Linux-based OSs, running a BC-250 is almost plug and play. There are still some shortcomings, and it's not perfect. But if you're looking for an inexpensive gaming PC, the juice on this one might be worth the squeeze. Let's take a closer look to see what's required to turn these into a gaming PC, what works, what doesn't, and more importantly, how I plan on using mine here in my server rack. Today's video is brought to you by Foudre. If you've been struggling to spin up AI models on your own, or are hesitant to invest tens of thousands of dollars in hardware, you should give Foudre a look. They offer hosted GPU solutions to fit any budget, from NVIDIA's V100s all the way up to NVIDIA's latest enterprise GPUs in the B300, ready to be put to use in your most demanding workloads. What's more, Foudre data centers run entirely on renewable energy, so your AI workloads don't just run fast, they also run green. Plus, with all Foudre servers residing in the EU, they're protected under GDPR and some of the world's strictest data privacy laws. You get secure ingress and egress of all of your data with no hidden compliance headaches. A couple weeks ago, we featured a coupon code for them in a video, and yeah, I probably should have proofread that before publishing. So today you can use coupon code CraftComputingOops for $25 in credit to give them a shot risk-free. So whether you're ready to move your AI workflows to the cloud, or just need to evaluate which solution is right for you, Foudre is the cloud provider that is fast, affordable, private, and sustainable. Again, that's Foudre.com, coupon code CraftComputingOops, and thanks again to Foudre for sponsoring today's episode. In my first go-round with the BC-250, I discovered a number of shortcomings with the hardware, the BIOS, the drivers, and like I mentioned, almost all of them have been fixed. We'll start at the top and work our way down. The BC-250, being an APU, has a pool of memory that it shares with both the CPU and the GPU portions of the chip. 16 gigabytes sounds like a decent amount of memory when you think of a gaming GPU, but not when it has to share those resources with the CPU and the rest of the system. By default, there were two configurations that the BC-250 shipped with, an even 8GB split, or the GPU allocating 10 gigabytes with the CPU getting 6. The difference was down to which firmware shipped on these units, and isn't configurable in the BIOS, and certainly not in the drivers, which obviously never properly installed. Today though, there's a BIOS mod available that not only unlocks variable RAM configurations, everything from 1GB to 12GB dedicated to the GPU or the CPU, setting the VRAM to 512 megabytes will enable dynamic memory shifting, just like we see on most retail APU solutions, letting the system determine how much memory to allocate to either the CPU or the GPU on the fly. What's better is installing the custom BIOS is dead simple. Head on over to the repo by Tux the Penguin and download the modified BIOS. You'll also need to head over to Electric M's GitHub page and download the EFI installer, along with a simple EFI shell. Copy the files to a USB key and plug it into the BC-250. Boot up to the USB drive, which will bring up a new EFI shell. Now, before you flash the new BIOS, make sure you have a copy of your existing BIOS, or a known good copy for your hardware, as it's really not known how many specific revisions or firmware versions are out there, and you don't want to unintentionally brick your board. Running flash.nsh will automatically flash and verify the modded BIOS, and then reboot the system once it's done. Once the BC-250 turns back on, and this part is important, shut it down, and you'll want to do a full BIOS reset by jumping the pins on the board itself. Those can be located right down here by the CMOS battery. Not resetting the BIOS to the defaults will result in missing menu options and general instability. This is a custom BIOS for an unofficial board after all, so make sure to follow this step. Inside of the new BIOS, you can now access the GPU configuration menu and set manual memory sharing to take full advantage of the system. However, I did encounter a bug when installing Bazzite if I left the memory settings at the defaults, or I enabled dynamic memory sharing. The installer would lock up before it was able to load the GUI. So if you're installing an OS for the first time, I would recommend setting a 2GB manual partition, then install your OS, and then switch back over to the 512 megabyte setting, which will enable dynamic allocation. Speaking of the OS install, what operating system should you be using? Let me preface this question with an absolute statement to put a particular question to bed once and for all. No, you cannot install Windows. That is both a blessing and a curse depending on who you ask, but the reasons for it are pretty simple. The vast majority of AMD's driver stack is open source in Linux, and as I mentioned, is mainlined into the Linux kernel. Because of the open source nature, that means that the community has been able to piece together a working driver for the BC-250 and all of its various components. None of that is possible on Windows. It won't be possible, and it's not going to work. Nearly everyone who has contributed code or fixes to make the BC-250 a viable platform has a note on their GitHub saying, please stop asking about Windows. And I just wanted to pass that message along. So please, stop asking about Windows. As far as what operating systems can you run, if you're looking at these for gaming, I would look no further than Bazzite. It's easy to install, it comes pre-configured with Steam and Lutris for game installs, Sunshine game streaming server is just a couple of clicks away, and it works essentially out of the box. Other distros like Foudre and Arch are supported, but again, as today we're focused on gaming, we're going to keep things nice and easy. Bazzite installs with no unexpected hiccups, and after about 10 minutes, reboots directly to the desktop with full GPU acceleration up and running. Like I mentioned, once it is installed, this is a good time to reboot into the BIOS and set the memory share to 512 megabytes to enable dynamic allocation. This will let the OS determine how much memory is needed in games by either the CPU or the GPU and give you the best performance. In my first look at the BC-250, I did comment about the insanely high power draw that these have at idle, especially given the hardware that we're dealing with. A 6-core APU, 16 gigabytes of memory, and a single NVMe drive were drawing nearly 100 watts when doing nothing. So even if these didn't work for gaming, it was far from worth it to run a 6-core AMD Zen 2 CPU at 100 watts idle, especially when the desktop chips equivalent to these have a max CDP of just 65 watts. That being said, there has been a ton of work in getting the idle power draw under control on these, as it was caused by the GPU not being able to clock down from its default 1500 MHz clock speed. Huge thanks to Vietzman over on GitHub, there's an auto-install script that you can download that adds a governor to the driver, allowing the GPU to automatically spin down when it's not being used, and should absolutely be installed if you plan on running these full-time. Running this one simple command and then rebooting the BC-250 is enough to take the idle from nearly 100 watts down to about 40 or 45 watts. A much more reasonable power draw when not being used, and making it feasible to keep multiple BC-250s running in my server rack for on-demand gaming. And that's the software pretty much done. From this point, you're ready to basically turn it on and start gaming, especially if you just wanted to connect a keyboard, mouse, and monitor to one of these blades. If you wanted to run these outside of the chassis, there are a ton of guides and cases and cooling options out there to run a BC-250 outside of this server as a standalone gaming machine. But that's not what I want to use them for. I want a fleet of 12 gaming nodes inside of this server chassis to be able to share out as a cloud gaming server, being able to remotely connect to a node from my MacBook, or from a gaming handheld, or my phone, or even my Steam Deck to get, 6 to 8 times the performance that that handheld has. One of the reasons it's taken me so long to revisit the BC-250, even after all of the tremendous success the community has had over the last year and a half, is because I don't want to game on one of these as a local device. Even though you can pick up a single BC-250 for around $100, you're still going to need an NVMe drive, you're going to need to 3D print your own enclosure, or spend how much having one printed for you, and figure out your own cooling solution. You'll also need a 300 watt or higher power supply with an 8-pin PCIe plug. It's not expensive, but it's also not free. When it's all said and done, you're probably looking at spending between $200 and $275 depending on what hardware you need to put together. It's still a decent deal for a standalone gaming PC, especially with RAM and storage prices that are currently skyrocketing. But it's, again, not how I intend to use mine. I want these to exist as headless machines in my server rack, which means running Sunshine as a streaming service. There's one major issue though. While the majority of the APU has been figured out by the community, the hardware video encoder in the AMD GPU is essentially still non-functional. We believe it's present in the hardware, and it's some weird middle ground between RDNA 1 and RDNA 2, but it doesn't seem to work properly with either driver set installed. That makes game streaming a bit more difficult, as we'll be relying on CPU encoding for most of that work. While that doesn't excite me, I finally decided to give it a try, and I'm really glad that I did. While video encoding does require around 12% CPU utilization, the quality has been more than acceptable in all of my testing. A small performance hit and visual quality hit, sure, but in a box that's already full of compromises, 12% performance hit out of your CPU is a pretty small penalty in return for what is a pretty decent game streaming experience. So, that's the setup, but how well does it perform? Now, going into this, I actually have some pretty high expectations about this hardware combo. You see, last month Valve announced their 2026 Steam machine and the specs to go along with it, where they claimed performance in that new machine is better than 70% of gaming PCs that are currently on the market. The combo that they came up with also sounds a bit familiar, especially if I'm glancing over this direction. They're using a 6-core Zen 4 based CPU and a 28 compute unit RDNA 3 graphics card. Performance should be about on par with an RX 7600M XT mobile GPU or the desktop 6600. Well, over in BC-250 land, we've got a 6-core Zen 2 based CPU along with a 24 compute unit graphics card based on RDNA 2. One generation older, sure, but in theory, should also be similar in performance to the RX 6600. And again, keep in mind, I'm testing all of this remotely via Sunshine, so CPU-based video encoding is happening during all of these tests. Running directly off the hardware is going to show some performance improvements if that's what you're aiming for, but again, that's not how I'm using mine. 3D Mark doesn't like to run very well in Linux, but I did manage to get Firestrike up and going, where we see a score of 13,565, a GPU score of 19,439, and a CPU score of 10,807. While I don't have an RX 6600 available for testing, I have previously benchmarked an RX 7600M XT external GPU paired with a Ryzen 7840U. Now keep in mind, this testing was done on Windows, paired with an 8-core CPU and with no remote streaming happening. This combo managed a score of 19,019 with a GPU score of 27,379, or roughly 50% faster than the BC-250. Looking for similar scores in my history, back when I tested the NVIDIA A2000, I came up with a GPU score of 16,539. The RTX 2060 is also very similar, with a GPU score of 20,508. All things considered, pretty decent company to be in. But how does this GPU compare to GPUs that I've previously benchmarked inside of cloud gaming servers? The Tesla P40, for example, can hit a graphics score of 21,755 when running a single gaming VM, slightly faster than our 19,000 score over here. But when doubling up that duty on the P40, the score drops to just 9,866. And the beloved Tesla P4 manages 12,151 in graphics. And keep in mind, these scores were also running remotely via Parsec, but with hardware acceleration enabled, so we're a bit closer to apples comparisons here. That means each BC-250 node in the server is roughly on par with some of the best performance I've ever gotten out of my cloud gaming server, at least when I'm not breaking my budget for NVIDIA A5000s. And remember, we've got 12 nodes inside of this box to work with. That means 12 players in a single 4U box. As far as game testing, I didn't do a full exhaustive suite. I think that's going to have to wait for another video, but I did run one of these nodes through its paces in some of my current favorites. Schedule 1 ran at around 35 FPS at 1080p on average, regardless if you're at high or low settings, something that I've seen before on other low-end hardware. But being an early access game by a single developer, I'm not entirely surprised it's not optimized for unknown graphics cards. Borderlands 4 at 1080p and low settings managed around 45 FPS on average. Pretty reasonable for a brand new game, and surprisingly playable at that frame rate. Having caught crabs at the most recent PDX LAN, I've made it my mission to give crabs to everyone else too, so we're gonna run this game here today. Crab Champions had no problems running in early and mid-game at a locked 120 FPS at 1080p and medium settings. If you haven't caught crabs yet, I highly recommend it, especially for just $10 over on Steam. Doom Eternal at 1080p and ultra settings, which is Doom Eternal's medium preset, had no problems at all, hitting about 140 FPS on average. While a lot of modern massive multiplayer games have issues with anti-cheat over on Linux, Helldivers 2 has no such issues. And at 1080p and medium settings, we get around 65 FPS on average, and a surprisingly playable experience. Teardown and its voxel-based destruction and physics can struggle on lower-end hardware, but manage to hold a pretty solid 60 FPS at 1080p and medium settings. Explosions and massive physics drops do drop frame rates down into the teens, but that happens on most systems with this game. And finally, Wreckfest is always a chore for budget systems with its liquid deformation physics. But even with a 24-grid race, we managed to hold 60 FPS at 1080p and medium settings. So overall, some pretty great performance out of a single node, and something that I'm going to keep experimenting with and tweaking over the next couple of months. While I'm thrilled with the progress made to make the BC-250 a viable gaming PC, Like I mentioned earlier, it's still not perfect. For starters, this full 12-node server is loud, as in one of the loudest 4U boxes that I have ever had hands-on with. The fans up front are a set of 5 80mm blow-emitrons with a combined 250 watts of power draw, just from the fans. There are a number of mods that people have made to quiet this chassis down, from a simple fan swap to replacing the entire front panel with mounts for 120mm fans. If I'm going to run the server full time, I need it to not be heard from down the block. Part of a fan swap will be ensuring that the nodes themselves are able to stay cool. That might mean directional baffles 3D printed between the fans and the heat sinks to make sure that the air actually goes through the fins. It also might mean experimenting with different thermal pastes and thermal pads and different solutions. Lots of options to go over to get the noise and temps both into acceptable ranges. And while the CPU is able to do video encoding and is doing a decent job, I would love to eventually see the GPU encoder work to take the heavy lifting for remote access. If the community can figure out a way to make this video encoder finally work, I'd be eternally grateful. Heck, I'll give you the full lineup of merch from craftcomputing.store as a bounty. So if you're able to prove that video encoding works on the GPU, hit me up. I will send a full care package your way. While I left the BC-250 for dead nearly 2 years ago, thanks to the community taking on the challenge, dare I say the BC-250 might be one of the best budget gaming rigs that you can get as we enter 2026. Again, it's not perfect, but for $100 on eBay and a little bit of elbow grease, they should make for a decent Steam machine. And 12 of them in a single box could make for a complete LAN party in the smallest possible package. If you have any ideas for things that you'd like to see me run on these systems, let me know down in the comments below. On your way down there, make sure to drop this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And that's going to do it for me in this one. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Cheers, guys. Every year on the Craft Computing Discord server, we host a Beer Secret Santa, where we ship each other cases of beer to unknown recipients. This year, my Secret Santa sent this one over from Evil Twin Brewing and immediately raised an eyebrow. This is the Greenhouse West Coast Pils, conditioned on American oak. I don't know that I've ever had an oak-aged Pilsner before, so I'm kind of excited. Now, I do know Evil Twin Brewing out of New York. I'm a huge fan of theirs, but we'll see how this one turns out. Oh, and I'm sorry, this is a collaboration between Evil Twin and Humble Sea Brewing, so it's a twofer. Cool. So one thing I noticed on the nose of this one, it reminds me of a Gosé. It reminds me of a salted beer. It kind of smells like the ocean. I mean, not like a fisherman's wharf, but it smells like being near the ocean. And if you live on one of the coasts, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Just a little bit of salt in the air. That's what I'm getting here. It's very, very pleasant. Ah, that is so good. That is crisp and bright. All of the descriptors that you would normally want with a good Pilsner. But it's got this richness in the body. And it has to be the oak. It has to be the oak that this was aged on. It's taken what is normally a sharp and bitey and dry beer. And while those characteristics are still very much present, it's a little bit warmer underneath it. It's got this like caramel sweetness way down low that helps balance all of those brighter flavors. I really like this one. This is super unexpected. Like I said, I've never had a barrel-aged Pilsner before, and if I have any Pilsners from here on out, I want them all to be barrel-aged.